Hello everyone, Cherilyn Gilligan here from the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. In the fall of 2019, I gave a presentation on my research into the common soldier's experience during the Battle of Plattsburgh as part of the annual Battle of Plattsburgh event at the Kent Delord House Museum. I've converted that presentation into a two-part narrated slideshow, and this is the second and final part. If you haven't seen part one, take a few minutes to check that out first. After digging into records and first-hand accounts of what happened at the battle and the aftermath, I got to take a look at the reinforcement plans for the forts, and shortly afterwards, the deterioration of the cantonment altogether. Macomb drew the map shown here and included it with his after-action report to the Secretary at War in the days after the battle. You can see the key on the bottom left and the forts at the top center. The title on the back, shown at the right here, reads Sketch of the Enemy Positions and Batteries at the Siege of Plattsburgh from 6th September 1814 to 11th inclusive. The misspelling of enemy is noted here and in citations, but corrected elsewhere for my personal sanity. This popular map was drawn by Rufus McIntyre, an American captain at Sackett's Harbor. It's drawn on the back of a letter dated January 1st, 1815, and it describes the changes made to the Plattsburgh fortifications after the battle in September of 1814. Some of the original text was destroyed, so there are blanks in the text, but a portion of the letter reads, "The cantonment is perfectly correct so far as it goes, having omitted many buildings in the rear. The forms, blank, but Fort Moreau is not rightly located, blank, to the west, so as to command the open space between the barracks. The forts are surrounded by deep ditches and pickets within the ditch. The bastions at the angles give a powerful command of the ditch, which is protected by abattis and like obstructions. To carry the work by escalade would require ladders of 20 feet in length, and should the enemy attempt it, they must suffer an irreparable loss." This is the front side of that document, showing the beautifully written letter. It begins left to right, as is typical, and then the text continues at a 90-degree angle to the beginning of the letter, and is inscribed across and in between the perpendicular words on the page. Something I encountered a lot during this research was confusion concerning these historic maps and others across various archaeological reports and recently published histories. This has a lot to do with the fact that these two maps were copied over and over by people, and those historic copies have since ended up in various historical societies and special collections libraries across the country. The two maps pictured here were scanned from collections at SUNY Plattsburgh. They're in a photograph negative format and enlarged. This image, or the map itself, is a hand-drawn copy of Macomb's Sketch of the Enemy Positions map, or I guess a photograph negative of the original hand-drawn copy. These photographic negatives were enlarged to show details, and they can be accessed at SUNY Plattsburgh's Special Collections Library with use of a light table. I enlarged the signature at the bottom right of this image. It is signed Copy of Original and dated 1859. This is a decent copy of that original Macomb map. Other copies I have encountered are not so great. This series of maps was also accessed at SUNY Plattsburgh's Special Collections Library, and they were the same enlarged photograph negative medium as the Macomb copy. I very roughly placed this series side by side as they would have fit together. The middle two were one sheet originally. These maps are dated March 1866, and the caption at the bottom left of the first map, on the left, reads, "NB. These sheets, numbers 1, 2, and 3, represent the ground at Plattsburgh occupied by the American forts, namely Fort Brown, Fort Moreau, and Fort Scott. It also shows the positions of the British batteries. Fort Tompkins and Gaines were erected after the British retired. March 1866, for report of inspection of barracks, see A2504. Part of the technical report I wrote for the city of Plattsburgh had to include all past archaeological investigations of the 6 sites listed in the contract. In one archaeological survey report from 1995, there was an overlay of an historic map over the present-day Oval Parade Ground, now called the U.S. Oval Park, where a survey had taken place. The map shown above was the closest I could find to whatever historic map they used as their overlay. This map is especially interesting because it looks like there are triangulated measurements between features, and there are also interior details in each of the forts. The historic overlay map from the 1995 archaeological report seems to have the same interior lines within the forts. I'm wondering if there are copies of this map out there that the 1995 report used, or if there's others out there like this that I just haven't seen or couldn't locate in time. So if anyone knows of more maps like this, please reach out to me. This was a big mystery. So we know the cantonment was fortified after the battle between 1814 and 1816. But by 1819 and through to 1825, more and more troops were moved out of Plattsburgh, and the forts were left to fall into disrepair. The grounds weren't completely abandoned, but activity moved away from the old forts. The old storehouses were used as temporary barracks while new barracks were built, probably right over the old ones, and a lot of the surrounding lands and buildings were leased out to farmers and other citizens. We know from historic documents that there was an ordinance to make people stop removing sand from Fort Brown in 1852. In 1868, the D&H Railroad came through and Fort Scott was leveled for railroad construction. In the 1890s, Fort Moreau was also leveled for the expansion of barracks and the creation of the Oval Parade Ground. There was documentation of the removal of soldiers' burials from Forts Scott and Moreau when they were leveled, so it's very likely that Fort Brown contains burials as well. There could be remaining burials where Fort Scott and Fort Moreau used to stand, though amazingly, we still don't know the location or exact footprints of these forts, or if they have been completely destroyed. Archaeological surveys in the 1990s didn't find features associated with either fort, but they did discover deep, intact strata in areas where features of Fort Moreau may survive, possibly the magazine from that fort, because it was noted to be 7 feet below the parade ground in historic documents. We also don't know the boundaries of the mass grave site on Crab Island from this battle. We have many accounts that describe people being buried there, a handful of which were popularized through the Plattsburgh Republican newspaper. This local paper and others, as well as historical accounts like Lossing's books, were a great tool for creation of public memory and commemoration of events from the war. Simeon Doty had several interviews in the papers and various books about his experience. He was a teenager in the American ranks, stationed further north of Plattsburgh during the battle. Here's an excerpt from an 1886 interview. "We went to Crab Island. I helped bury the dead there. We landed on the north part of Crab Island. There were 2 hospitals there made of plank. The dead were carried off southward and were buried in trenches without coffins, under command of an officer. Redcoats and bluecoats were put in together." Shortly after the war, the owner of the island, Caleb Nichols, wrote up a bill to the U.S. government for tearing up the place and burying soldiers on his property. Different accounts report different numbers of how many people were buried on Crab Island. Some say 100 to 200, but there were potentially a lot more people buried there, considering the hundreds of sick and dying people moved through the island before the battle took place. We also don't have data for how many people survived their injuries and surgeries after the battle was over. I don't think we know for sure if Nichols ever submitted that bill to the government or if he was reimbursed for anything. References to the grave site would still appear in the historic record from time to time, but nothing was ever really done to mark the cemetery until 1903, and by that time the exact grave location was lost from public memory. I recommend the book The Secrets of Crab Island by James Millard if you want to really dive into Crab Island history. But generally, in 1903, the U.S. government tried to make Crab Island the McDonough National Military Park. They raised a flag and a monument and tried, and failed, to relocate the burials, and shortly afterwards, the grounds fell into disrepair again. In the 1960s, the island was sold into private hands, being briefly owned by the self-described hot dog mogul of Atlantic City in the 1980s. That episode prompted New York State to take the island back under state control. Since being under state control again, the island has been cared for by very few people. Mr. Roger Harwood, a Plattsburgh historian, has been clearing the grounds with his own equipment for a decade, while people like Harwood and Mr. John Rock, who is a Friends of Crab Island Commodore, have put a lot of time into getting a flag reinstalled and bringing people's attention to the island as a place of commemoration and a place that needs to be conserved and cared for long term. In short, Harwood, Rock, and many others are working to rebuild public memory of the Battle of Plattsburgh so that these important stories can be passed on to our future generations. One last highlight of conducting this research was getting to crowdsource information through public meetings and networking with local experts. I had the opportunity to attend several meetings with the city and town of Plattsburgh in Peru and meet people who wanted to share their knowledge with me and help me locate sources that I was either unaware of or had been unsuccessful in locating. This was really rewarding experience, both personally and professionally. It was my experience in these meetings that led me to explain a bit more about the mechanism driving the research that I was contracted to do with the city of Plattsburgh. When working on cultural resource management projects like these, you have limited time to gather as much information as you can, and it can make all the difference when you find local experts and an interested public that are willing to spend time and share their research and stories and their resources. As a result, the researcher is able to elevate those important stories and help conserve the local public memory, sometimes through technical reports that may inform future historic trails, panels and exhibits, park displays, and things like that. I think it all boils back down to why people are interested in history at all. We love storytelling. People love a good story. Most often, your research turns into a great storytelling session at the Historical Society where the hours fly by and you have to run to catch the ferry before rush hour gets really bad. You're connecting with other interested people about the past, and you're connecting with the past through personal perspectives, collectively imagining and wondering what it was like to be there in Plattsburgh leading up to this battle. And then, like a detective, you try to ask the right questions and search for evidence and primary accounts that might tell you where people were, when, and how they felt and what they saw. I want to end by saying thanks to a few of the folks who were so helpful to my research. Thanks to Keith Herklow for providing me with copies of a really important CRM report that I hadn't been able to locate, and for fielding some of my questions. Thanks to Don Wickman for fielding tons of questions as well as sending sources and maps my way. Your enthusiasm is contagious. And a really big thank you to Roger Harwood and Ed Skolin, not only for your expertise on this subject matter, but for spending so much time helping me out with site visits to Valcour Island and Crab Island. It was such a blast going out there with both of you. And for diving some of the sites with me as well. Both of you have such a wealth of knowledge, and it was a joy to work with both of you, so thank you so much. And last, I'll end with this image. This is an image of McDonough pointing the cannon on flagship Saratoga during the Battle of Plattsburgh. There is a great folk tale about this particular rooster that you can read more about in Lossing's Pictorial Field Book and elsewhere. This rooster became a sort of mascot for the American soldiers during the battle. He was a sought-after bird in the cockfighting ring happening on shore in the days leading up to the battle, and the sailors, by hook or by crook, obtained possession of him, so that he was caged aboard Saratoga on the morning of the battle. As Saratoga took shot from Linnet, the cage was hit and the rooster burst out, flew upon the gun slide, and clapping his wings, crowed lustily and defiantly. The sailors cheered, and the incident, appearing to them as ominous of victory for the Americans, strengthened the courage of all. These are the endnotes for part 2 of the presentation. If anyone wants to look up any of the quotes that I read, or see where some of the imagery came from, you can find the citations here. And here is the full bibliography for parts 1 and 2 of this presentation. Thank you so much for spending this time with us at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum and the Kent Delord House Museum to commemorate the 206th anniversary of the Battle of Plattsburgh. I'm happy to field any questions you might have, so please get in touch with us at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. You can reach me at cherg@lcmm.org. That's CHERG@lcmm.org.